to explain a bit about who I am, my background. So I'm by training a psychologist who for the last 25 years has been doing psychology by trying to build robots. So my goal is to understand myself and understand other animals by building robots. I call it synthetic psychology. 3 years ago we started the Sheffield Centre for Robotics. We have a lot of different robotics groups at Sheffield, not quite as big as Imperial, but we've done all right in terms of funding from the SRC. And we have across both universities in Sheffield about 50 full-time academic staff interested in robotics and more students and postdocs. So a lot of activity going on, and we created the centre as a kind of umbrella to help us bring that together and have more joint projects. I want to start out by talking about the use of robots in care. So this is about the longer-term perspective, and to motivate, I think, the program of work that I've started along with Sebastian and other collaborators. We all know about the issue of the aging society, but I don't think we think about it or talk about it enough, so I'll remind you. The graph on the right here shows the situation in 2008. This is the number of males and females at different ages. I think this is for EU, for the European Union. And you can see the outline of what's projected for 2033. And if you compare those two shapes, for both men and women, there's going to be many more people in the age group of over 60, over 70, over 80, over 90 than there are today. So, and 2033 is not very far away, I think, in terms of planning the technologies we want to have. So, the largest change in the demographic is the group of over 60. And by 2060, there'll be one working person for every dependent person. That's somebody who's of working age or under 18. And that compares to a ratio of 3 to 1 at the moment. So this is a very dramatic change. And this is important because 10% of the people over 60, although many of them will still be active and making an important contribution, there will be more disability, because disability unfortunately comes with age, and that will mean some increase in dependency. So 20% of those age 70 plus may need some assistance with a disability, and 50% of those of us who are 85 plus will need help because of disabilities that we will have. So this is a very important thing to bear in mind when we think about developing technologies. Now, this slide just has a lot of statistics where I put them together for the SIG. 65% of our current Department of Development pension spending goes to those who are over working age. That's 1/7 of our public spending. And the scary bit is we can expect to add an additional 10 billion for every additional 1 million people over working age. That's 10 million each year we'll have to find as the aging population increases, as people over 60 increase. Now, if we look at public expenditure on long-term care, it's currently 11.3 billion, or that was 2010. It's expected to be 31 billion by 2032. That's an increase of a factor of 3. Private expenditure is growing at the same rate. So this is long-term care. It's not quite the same as NHS spending, but over the last several weeks we've had all the political parties arguing about how they're going to support the NHS. I think only the Lib Dems wanted to increase spending in the NHS, and it's really unrealistic to think that we can move forward with an aging society without spending a great deal more on caring for ourselves. It's not just a crisis of money, it's also a crisis of skilled workers. So skilled nurses and residential care workers are in demand. That there's unfilled jobs, and there'll be an increase in the number of jobs that we need to fill by up to 1 million by 2025. So that's just 10 years away. And we all know from stories in the press, we see every day that there's high turnover in this sector, there's low wages, there's often very poor standards of care, and neglect of basic human rights for people that are being cared. So it's a terrifying scenario, I think, for all of us in this room. Certainly me, I'm over 50 now, so I'm going to be in this bulge of people that are going to need to have extra help. And the question is, where can the help come from? Are we going to really expect, for every one of us who's going to be old, there's going to be one of the one-to-one ratio that's going to help us. Now, if we're lucky, we'll have a partner to care for us, or for children to help care for us. But I think the solution is actually to also make use of technology. So it's not the entire solution at all. There are many other things we must do, but technology can be part of it. So I think robots can help carers, and they won't help carers by replacing carers. I think that's very unlikely. I've got another talk I can give where I explain why I think that won't happen. But I think they can help address the shortage of skilled labour. Particularly, they can help human carers to be more efficient, and they can help older people to help each other, because I think that's what we will be doing. We will be helping each other as we get older, rather than relying on younger people who will be rushing around doing all the other jobs. They will let carers focus on the human aspects of their work, and that will help make caring a more professional job, and it will make care work more rewarding. So I think it's good news for carers. It will take away a lot of the mundane work that carers have to do and give them something that's more interesting and more rewarding. We'll also help reduce some of the injuries that happen to carers. So many skilled, trained carers and nurses have to leave the profession because they get back injuries. And if we could relieve that, then we would reduce some of the skill shortage in the care world. So robots won't solve all the problems, but they can help. And I'm happy to discuss this further. We can help because we can help to care people in their own homes. And a lot of the cost that comes out of care is when people move into care facilities. It costs around £25,000 a week, I think, to keep somebody in a care home. And no, that must be a month. Maybe a year? Anyway, it's a lot more expensive than caring for somebody at home. Home is the primary context in which we want to grow old. We like to age in place. And as we grow old, we spend more time in our own homes. And the home environment gives us positive health outcomes. We're healthier there. If we're outside the home, we're more likely to have negative health outcomes. So if we could use assistive technologies, including robots, to help people live in their own homes for longer, we not only reduce the burden of the cost of care, but it also give people more rewarding lives. So it's a win-win. For the Robot Companions for Citizens EU pilot project, we wrote this roadmap. It's available to download. It's a few years old now, but it sets out some scenarios of how we might use robots to empower older people and help them look after themselves in the future. The reason we need robots is that a lot of the disabilities that we have as we get older are physical, and we can't fix these using telehealth or using computers and iPads and iPhones. We can't do remote care via Skype for most of the problems that people face. So bathing, dressing, toileting, continence, feeding, transferring yourself from a bed into a chair, preparing meals, housekeeping, gardening, taking out the rubbish, doing your laundry, moving around, general mobility. These are all things where we can't fix that without having technologies that act in the world, and those technologies have to be robotic. There's a hierarchy of decline which gerontologists have described, which is as we get older, it gets more difficult to maintain the lifestyle that you have. You have to reduce the amount of activity, you get tired more easily, you have to set fewer life goals. And so we can imagine robots that help us to maintain our lifestyle longer. We then lose the capacity to maintain our environment. It's harder to keep the garden looking tidy, it's harder to keep the house clean. And ultimately we lose the capacity to maintain ourselves. It's harder to dress, it's harder to keep on top of personal hygiene. And so we can think of robots assisting in all these different areas with lifestyle, environment, and personal care. We can use robots perhaps to help promote a healthier lifestyle, so encouraging people to stay healthy as they grow older. I think an important current application in robotics is to develop robot facilitators that can help people to engage with each other. I'm going to show you later, perhaps in the lunch break, this robot, which is a robot seal developed in Japan called Paro. And I think Paro is really a social facilitator amongst other things. If you take them into an old people's home, they talk to each other as much as they interact with the robot. we'll hear later about some entertainment robots. I think entertainment robots are important in the sector of promoting social interaction, participation as we grow older. Help with the environment is where robots have been really successful already, I think. Someone mentioned the dishwasher as a robot. I think the automatic washing machine is the real success of robots, and perhaps the first robot in the home was this one, the first automatic washing machine. I think it was sold in 1937, and nowadays I remember in the 80s you bought an automatic washing machine, there was 20 buttons on the front and you had to program exactly what you wanted the washing machine to do. Now there might just be a start button, because the robot, the washing machine is intelligent. It measures the load, it decides how dirty it is, it decides how long to wash for, what temperature, how long to dry for. Vacuum cleaners also become robotic. And as these things become robotic, we stop thinking of them as robots, we think of them as household appliances, and we take for granted their robotic functionality. And I think that's what will happen in care, is that we'll have more and more machines which have robotic functionality, and we will stop thinking about them as robots. We'll just think, why did anyone ever push a machine around on the floor to pick up dust? Because vacuum cleaners, obviously there should be small things that move around by themselves and suck it up. Lawnmowers also is happening. And in the future, I think we will have home helps that are more versatile, and Sebastian will talk about this too. They'll be able to tidy, they might be able to petrol shopping, put it away, and so on. They might be able to help prepare meals. We are working at the moment with funding from Innovate UK to develop a smart table, a robotic table, and Sebastian will tell you about that. And the final thing is to help with our personal care. As we grow older, we'll have more problems maintaining ourselves. Cognitive impairments, physical impairments, disease and illness, depression and withdrawal, all kind of increase or affect our ability to care for ourselves. We need technologies for physical mobility and self-care. We need to have technologies which we can use and which are things that were attractive to us as users. So we're interested, myself and Sebastian, in developing things which are less stigmatizing than a lot of the technology we currently have around caring for the elderly. You know, it's stigmatizing, and it affects your sense of dignity to use some of these technologies. And I think we can use robots to improve people's dignity, or to give them back some of their dignity. There's a device that can help me, and I don't necessarily have to have another person help me do something which is something very personal, like maintaining my hygiene. To do this, we need advances in human-robot interaction, particularly physical interaction and soft robots, which brings me on to the last part of my talk. How long have I got? Yeah, okay, well, we'll do this quickly. So this is the even more controversial bit. Robots that know themselves will make better carers, is my claim. If you've seen the film Robot and Frank, and I recommend that you all do, it's the story of a man with Alzheimer's who gets a personal care robot. It's not a robot you can buy today, but maybe in 20 to 30 years' time, perhaps by the time that we hit this demographic bulge, robots with this kind of competence will be available. They may not look humanoid. I think it's likely that we'll have robots all different shapes and sizes. But in this film, it's a humanoid robot. And the interesting thing about this robot is that Frank befriends the robot. Against his own idea of what a robot should be, he finds himself becoming attached to the robot as a companion. And I think that will happen. And I don't think it's a bad thing either. And I think the reason that we worry about robots is that we see them as being like ourselves. And we think, well, if robots become too like ourselves, then perhaps they're going to think, well, why are we looking after humans? Why aren't we taking over the world? And that's the usual question I get from journalists. They build up to it with a few other ones, and then they say, well, come on, what do you think? When will robots take over the world? And I think we can design robots that are better helpers, but they don't necessarily have to be robots that are going to have even the desire to take over the world. And I think the reason for that is the anthropomorphism we project onto robots is based on a misconception of the things that robots are like that can be similar to humans. So I'm going to very briefly mention some philosophy here, because at the back of this worry, I think, is the idea of the self, which you can trace back to many different sources, but I want to mention Descartes and his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," which was his way of saying, as a philosopher, I can't really go beyond the idea of myself as a thinking agent. The self is primary, it's unanalyzable, it interacts with my brain in some way I don't understand. The self is there, it's just there, and it's what tells me that I am and that I exist. And I think this idea is in our culture, the idea of a self being unchanging, being primary, you're born with it, you live with it throughout your life, perhaps it even survives your death. There is another culture in which there is no self. Buddhism has the concept of non-self, or the illusion of self. Its real objection is to the concept of an unchanging self in the Cartesian sense. And Buddhists say, well, clinging to this idea of the self is actually a source of much of our unhappiness. So the Western idea of the self isn't necessarily the only way of viewing these things. So I'm a psychologist. I have a view of the self as having many parts. There's a list down the left-hand side here. I have a point of view. I distinguish myself from others. I have a feeling of owning my body. I make decisions. I have awareness of my personal past and of my future. I recognize myself. I look in a mirror. I see that's me. I see other people as being agents or selves like me. I have an idea of what I am. I have a story about my life that I tell myself and other people. I have personal goals. I have the feeling of free will. I have a stream of consciousness. Now, all of these things go together to make the self, and I think we can break it down. And what's interesting is that when we break it down, we can see things that we would like robots to have and things that we wouldn't like robots to have. So we wouldn't like robots to have the sense of free will and to have their own goals. Could we take that out and give robots goals that we want them to have? And I think they can be effective agents that can help us. Psychologists have split these two. William James split it into the I and the me, the experiential side of the self and the conceptual side of the self. Ulrich Neisser split it into the physical or ecological self, the temporal, social and narrative selves. Very quickly, the physical self is this feeling that you have a body, this knowledge of where you are in space, that you can move without bumping into things, that there's a point of view from which you see the world. That's very important, I think, for us to be safe in the world. If you lose your sense of your physical self, you won't be able to stand up, you won't be able to wave to a friend. All these things rely on your feeling of body ownership and your body schema. There's the temporal self, your knowledge of who you were yesterday, your ability to conceive of who you might be tomorrow. And from psychological experiments and from neuroscience experiments, we know these two things are intimately linked, the same bits of the brain that allow you to remember the past, allow you to think about and imagine the future. And then there's the social self, which is what allows us to think of other people as being selves like us, and therefore to understand and imagine what their point of view might be, what you might ultimately call empathy. I like this cartoon, a woman who thinks maybe her cat should have empathy, and when the cat kills the mouse, maybe it should think about what that's like for the mouse. Well, that's funny because we don't think cats have empathy, but we think other people do. And I think it would be useful if we could build robots that could understand what it's like to be a human self and could have empathy for our situation, particularly somebody who might need help. Infants don't have a complete sense of self in the way that adults do, so they have a point of view, they can distinguish themselves from others, they have a feeling of owning their bodies, they act to make decisions. But, for instance, they don't recognize themselves in a mirror until at least age 2. They don't see other people as being selves, at least certainly they don't understand that adults have other things to do in their lives other than care for their children. And if you have a toddler, you will know that. And you might also notice when your child reaches age 4, they achieve that understanding. It's called, by psychologists, theory of mind. And with theory of mind, they understand that you're a self, you have other problems in your life that you have to solve. And actually that helps you get on with your children because suddenly they join this community of adults who understand each other and share some empathy. They're not without empathy, it's just that they don't realize that your life is about anything other than looking after them until they reach age 3, 4. And you can lose parts of yourself. There's many cases, I'll just describe one, a patient who suffered brain damage to a traffic accident and he lost the ability to remember his personal past. The patient's name was NN. And he also actually lost the ability to imagine his own future. You know, he was asked, what's it like if you think about the future? And he says, well, I really don't know. And he pushed on that, and he said, well, it's like being in the middle of the lake without being able to touch the bottom. There's nothing there that I can access to think about my personal future. But he had a sense of himself, most definitely. He knew who he was. He had a story about himself from before his accident, but he just couldn't remember anything happened to him recently or imagine the future. So you can take the self and you can split it into these different parts, and we can imagine putting some of these aspects of self into a robot. So a robot could have a point of view, distinguish itself from others, feel its body, make decisions, have awareness of past and future, recognize itself perhaps, see others as agents, have an idea of what it is. It doesn't necessarily have personal goals, a feeling of free will, even a stream of consciousness. Maybe that would be an emergent property of these things, I don't know. But we could certainly build a robot. And Robot and Frank shows this idea of a robot that has some of these abilities, is able to communicate and empathize, but perhaps doesn't have the same struggle that we do as evolved biological beings to survive and maybe dominate our environments. So a robot carer with these things, the physical self, would be safer around people. With a social self, would be able to communicate more effectively with us and would be able to better understand our needs. And with the temporal self, would be able to personalize the care it provides. It could remember you and what your needs are and be able to anticipate how it could help you better. So I want to finish just by describing a project that I'm involved in. It's called What You Say Is What You Did. It's about developing a robot with a sense of self, particularly focusing, in our case, on this temporal self, and on the ability to understand other people and their actions, and to interpret their actions and communications, and try and make the robot more human compatible. I think I've probably run out of time, so I'll just let this video play. This is from collaborators in Barcelona, and this is the iCub robot, and we're working on this platform with the people in Barcelona to develop these different elements of the self. I wouldn't say we're that well progressed with it. We have communication, the robot and the human can interact. The robot has a sense of its own physical self. It knows where its arms and its hands and its head is, so it has a body schema, and that makes it safer. It has a temporal self, and that it has some autobiographical memory. We want to make that more realistic and more lifelike, and that's some of the research for the future. Thank you very much.